Welcome to Chapter 6, Reconstructing Women's Lives, North and South. The years 1865 to 1900 was a time after the Civil War that affected women of all genders and classes. Some women determined to transcend societal limits, laws, and expectations. After the assassination of President Lincoln and the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, Congress had a greater role and was dominated by the Republicans. The Republicans of this time period were these radical abolitionists. And so, because of their determination to end slavery in the most radical way possible, they were determined to do this in Congress by passing the 14th Amendment in the year 1866. The 14th Amendment gave African Americans the right to citizenship and promised that there would be no discrimination against them by the law. In fact, quoting from the 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the U.S. and of the state wherein they reside. Notice that that quote from the 14th Amendment doesn't specifically say men or women, but kind of includes all persons. They also passed the 15th Amendment by 1870. This advanced black suffrage by forbidding disenfranchisement on the grounds of, and I quote, race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Notice that none of them mentioned women. In reaction to the passing of the 15th Amendment, there's two groups that form in regards to furthering women's rights. There's a split in forming women's rights. So we've got the NWSA, which stands for the National Women's Suffrage Association. It was founded in May of 1869 by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They broke ties with the Republicans because they were so livid that the Republicans did not include women in the 15th Amendment. It was just out of reach. So they broke ties with the Republicans, but they advocated for female suffrage in radical ways that was asserted at the federal level and beyond. We do also have, like I said, a split. So we have the NWSA, but then we have another organization that's founded, the AWSA, which stands for American Women's Suffrage Association, which was founded later, November 1869, by Lucy Stone and her husband. So Lucy Stone had also been a big-time female advocate who had fought for female rights before, but she took a different stance with the AWSA because she and her organization supported the Republicans and female suffrage. So the thought was this: okay, the Republicans didn't mention women in the 15th Amendment, but maybe if we keep working with them, something will change. I mean, after all, African Americans finally achieved their freedom. So it was, there's so many things to tackle. And the controversy of giving women the right to vote too, it might have been too much at the time. The AWSA, their activism was mild, and it was done through the state level. I do want you to note, just briefly, that later on in the 1890s, these two organizations did come together, but before that, they could not tolerate each other, and their activism was completely different. So the NSWA mission statement included these topics. Number 1, women were persons whose rights as national citizens were established by the 14th Amendment. Number 2, The right to vote was a part of being a citizen. And number three is known as the New Departure Theory. It's the concept that women already had the right to vote and didn't need any change in Congress or legislation. So let me go back to that quote that I had from the 14th Amendment. Okay, so listen to this again. All persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the U.S. and of the state wherein they reside. Well, women took this literally and said, well, yeah, I'm a person born here, I was naturalized in the U.S., so I should be treated just the same as anyone else. And they literally tried to do this with their right to vote. That comes to our next slide. When it comes to activism, Susan B. Anthony went to her local polling place and persuaded the poll workers to let her vote. 2 weeks later, she was arrested for violating federal law. She was found guilty in the court, but the judge refused to give her jail time, so she couldn't appeal her verdict. We also have uninvited members of the NSWA that barged into this event that was commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in Pennsylvania. The NSWA members got up at the podium and they spoke as loudly as they could, and they said that every man, black and white, had full rights as citizens, but all women did not, and this was something that needed to be rectified. Continuing on with the NSWA activism is in regards to this court decision, Minor versus Happersett in 1875. A woman by the name of Virginia Minor had sued a poll worker who refused to let her vote. The Supreme Court ruled that she was a citizen, but voting was not a right, but a privilege that was bestowed by the federal government. This decision, number one, eradicated the New Departure Theory. And number two, it narrowed the view of the 14th and the 15th Amendments. In reaction, the NSWA advocated a separate constitutional amendment modeled after the 15th Amendment to bar disfranchisement on sex. And this wording ended up in the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920, which allowed women the right to vote. So we spent time on our first topic, which was about the split in the Organization for Furthering Female Rights. These women were outspoken, and so were the women who earned their freedom in the South. They were outspoken in regards to the challenges of Reconstruction and redemption. But with these challenges also came some positive things. So, first of all, Reconstruction pertained to the revision of the U.S. Constitution to deal with the consequences of emancipation. But at the same time, this concept of Reconstruction was about grappling with emancipation and rebuilding the South. Redemption also occurred during this time. It was a time period when the white supremacists were attempting to reclaim and reassert their supremacy. You see, the South had lost their slaves. The South had lost leaving the Union because they lost the Civil War. So, in reaction, they tried to reassert and reclaim their supremacy and their power. So, what was life like for black women who were freed in this new South? What did they do? What would you do? Well, some of them, believe it or not, remained with their masters. And this is because that was the life they knew. That's how they grew up, and they were afraid to leave. Secondly, others search for separated family. So in the book, there is this quote about a woman who found her husband that she hadn't seen for 3 years, but he was with another woman. And it goes like this. He said, "I don't know which I love best, you or Anna. Try to marry some good man, and do it because you love me, and not because I think more of the wife I have got than I do you." So, when they were separated from family members, from husbands, from wives, they weren't always happy to see who they found because circumstances had changed. A lot of these freed black women were absolutely tired of working on the plantation. They're sick, they were tired of it, they were disgusted by it. And so too were their husbands, who made sure that their women didn't return to the field as a way to reassert their dominance as men. Sharecropping was when a white landowner cut a small portion of land for the family to live on. So the positivities of this is that it wasn't exactly the same as slavery because there was no one driving them, there was no one beating them, and they could work as a family and actually kind of have a little bit of land to themselves. But their work as sharecroppers was very similar to being an indentured servant because they were usually indebted for the rest of their life because the crop yield that they raised most times did not equal the credit that the white man extended to them. And also we have education. A lot of freed black women sought out education. This was funded by the Freedmen's Bureau, and I'll talk about them in the next slide. So public education was in the form of religious education, public and private institutions. One example is the Atlanta Baptist Female Seminary that was funded by Rockefeller, and it was all female, all women. And the women who attended these institutions, many of them ended up becoming black leaders and teachers. The Freedmen's Bureau was founded in 1865, and it was meant to provide relief and support to the newly emancipated. What did they do? They legalized marriages. So, during the Civil War, the slaves that wanted to get married couldn't do it legally. It wasn't seen as legal in the eyes of the government. They did have the jumping the broom, but again, that was not actually legalized. So the Freedmen's Bureau actually legalized marriages of free men and free women who wanted to do so. They ensured that freed people had parental rights over their children. So let me explain. With redemption, with the instituting white supremacy over the freed black people, came something known as the apprenticeship laws, part of the black codes, and I'll explain that later as well, in which during court cases, there were children taken away from their freed parents. If the court saw the parents as unfit parents, the children would be taken away, they would be put into a life of indentured servitude, and they were not paid, and they were not allowed to go back to their moms and dads. So the Freedmen's Bureau made sure that they fought for these freed black parents to have parental rights over their children so that they didn't lose their children. They also, like I mentioned before, funded education. So this brings us to the Black Codes. The Black Codes, which were issued by Southern states between the years 1865 and 1866, restricted Black labor and activity. It limited the freedoms of the newly emancipated to make sure that there was availability as a labor force. So in Mississippi, which was one of the first to issue the Black Codes, they required a written evidence of employment for the coming year. And if that Black person failed in the obligation, they would have to surrender their past wages and it was possible that they would get jail time. In South Carolina, the Black Codes there issued a law only to Blacks to work as a farmer or a servant, and if they refused to do so, they would have to pay an annual tax of anywhere between $10 to $100. Also a part of redemption was the establishment in 1866 of the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan. They reasserted white supremacy using torture and violence of the worst kinds. Many times, freed Black men were accused of raping white women and therefore were lynched by the KKK. Freed Black women were the target of sexual humiliation, rape, and murder by the KKK. Society accused free Black women of being sexually promiscuous and immoral. Let me give you an example which is in your book. In Georgia, 2 Klansmen in 1871 attacked a freed Black woman by the name of Rhoda Ann Childs, and she said, "They stretched my limbs as far apart as they could and applied the strap to my private parts until I fatigued into stopping. I was more dead than alive." They then raped her with the barrel of a gun, and that's on page 292 for reference. The purpose of the KKK and their actions was to reassert the authority and control over the bodies of freed Black women. It was almost like they wanted to go back to the times of when they were the slave master and they could do whatever they want. They wanted to humiliate these freed Black women and also show their husbands that they were not in control of their women, but the KKK were. Well, all of these things going on in the New South, the redemption, the KKK, the lynchings, the negative view of freed Black women, stirred Ida B. Wells so much that she wrote to expose all of these things and prove that they were false. Okay, so she was a journalist, she wrote about this, she wanted to expose and show that this was false. That in fact, freed Black men were not raping white women as they were accused of doing by the KKK. And she wanted to show that they were lynched by the hundreds over the years. She also exposed the fact that free Black women were not sexually immoral, that this was a false view of them. In fact, she tried to rally freed Black women together to fight against these injustices and these horrible societal views. So now we go to our next topic, which is the topic of the new woman. She was a radical departure from the ideology of the true woman. In order to understand the new woman, we have to look at the time period of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was a time period of growth, of wealth, of the middle and upper class, thanks to the continuation of industrialization. So these major industrialists like Vanderbilt with the railroads, J.P. Morgan in finance, Andrew Carnegie with steel, Not only were these major millionaires and industrialists of their own kind, but they also were philanthropists. They truly contributed to the economy. Just to give you an idea, in New York alone, the millionaires were only about a handful in the year 1860, about 12 to 13. By 1865, there were hundreds of millionaires just in New York alone. Because of this wealth, we see the wives of the wealthy who were supposed to act feminine. They were supposed to be beautiful, graceful, frivolous with money, believe it or not, fragile and on display like a doll in a doll's house. She was expected to shop. The husband expected her to shop, to be frivolous with money, and so the homes were filled with expensive furniture and decoration. They lavished themselves with the most beautiful of gowns. In fact, I found this quote very interesting by the sociologist Thorstein Veblen. He wrote in the year 1899 that upper-class women not only purchased expensive commodities, but were themselves their husband's most lavish and enviable possessions. Just as a side note, if you get a chance, check out the series Mr. Selfridge. It's on PBS. Harry Gordon Selfridge was the first retail king in London, and it's acted by Jeremy Piven. You see what the women looked like, their dresses, how they lived, how they were supposed to act, how men were supposed to act. And you see the beginnings of, basically the first beginnings of a mall. Fun fact, women purchasing makeup or stockings, it was seen as kind of scandalous. So stockings and makeup was not on display. They would have to go to the person working the counter to ask for these items very secretively. Wives of the wealthy had decreased birth rate. So between the years 1850 to 1890, the number of births for white women decreased from 5.42 to 3.87. So these women who had money to spend decided to have fewer kids, but why? Well, it was for personal satisfaction and contribution beyond being just a mom. Now, the next points that I'm going to get to were more controversial in regards to the wives of the wealthy. Women who were bicycling, which I will get to in the next slide, it was not necessarily seen as necessary for a wealthy wife. It was kind of looked down upon. Coeducation for wives of the wealthy was kind of looked down upon. And so these 2 points right here, I'm going to get my, sorry about that, my pen out. These two right here, bicycling and coeducation, not necessarily popular for wives of the wealthy, but women did do it. And last but not least, we have hired help, which I'm drawing an arrow towards. I apologize, I messed up the slide. So hired help. Wives of the wealthy expected to have at least 1 to 2 hired help. Nanny, nurses, maids, laundresses were expected to provide their service to the upper class women. The hired help were the poor class. Sometimes these were immigrant women. They were looking to try to get financial stability, and they did this by serving as nannies and maids and so on and so forth. When you view A Doll's House, you're going to see that Nora has hired help, and that her friend, Christine Lind, is part of this poor class. Not that she was hired help, but she was poor. Not everyone had the privilege that. And so what's kind of like radical that women engage in is bicycling. They're, just to be a little, I know it sounds a little graphic, but women were spreading their legs to ride the bicycle. Oh my heavens. I mean, even back in the day when women rode a horse, they had to ride side saddle, not spread their legs over the horse to ride the horse. Look at these women, that's how they're getting around. And we have this British song that was written in 1890 that was a parody on Rockabye Baby. So it goes, rock-a-bye baby, for father is near. Mother is biking, she never is here. Out in the park, she's scorching all day, or at some meeting is talking away. Oh my gosh, what a satire. So here, mom is out, she's on her bicycle. I mean, today we would say in her car, right? Ha ha ha. She's not in the house where she belongs in the domestic sphere. She's out doing frivolous stuff, like talking at a rally meeting for feminist rights. She's not with baby, she's out. This was a characteristic of the new woman, not of the true woman. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in her speech, The Solitude of the Self, probably said it best when she said, "The point I wish plainly to bring before you on this occasion," she began, "is the individuality of each human soul. In discussing the rights of woman, we are to consider, first, what belongs to her as an individual in a world of her own, the arbiter of her own destiny." This speech was sung with praises by suffrage leadership. Her vision was to relentlessly push the women's conventional values, and it was an emphasis of the most modern kind to praise women, to encourage them to get into this feminist mode, to seek out her own destiny. And I feel like when you view A Doll's House, this embodies, at the end of the movie, Nora's actions. Nora leaves the ideology of the true woman and becomes new woman. So let me give you a little intro into A Doll's House. So first of all, I thought that it would be kind of like nice of me to let you view A Doll's House for this chapter and for the discussion board. You can absolutely read the book, that's not a problem. But I thought it's kind of cool to actually watch the actors bring it to life and to see how things were back then. So A Doll's House was actually a play written by Henrik Ibsen in the year 1879. It played in the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen, Denmark, and the audience was absolutely shocked and outraged over this controversy of this woman acting the way she did. The outrage was so controversial that it was written about in newspapers all over the world. So why was it so shocking? You're going to find out, and you're going to discuss it. Here are the characters, and I truly encourage you to write down each character and who they are, just so when you view it, you have a little concept of who they are. Nora is the wife of Torvald, and she is the protagonist. Torvald is the husband of Nora. Torvald is the joint manager of the bank. Krogstad is a lawyer who went to school with Torvald and holds a lower position at the bank. He blackmails Nora. We have Mrs. Christine Lind, who is Nora's childhood friend, and she lives in poverty. Really pay attention to the dynamics between Mrs. Lind and Nora and the differences. And we have Dr. Rank, who unfortunately is the dying friend of Torvald. When you view the movie, I want you to see the dynamic between Dr. Rank and Nora. Notice how she acts with him. And I hope that this is a point of discussion as well in our discussion board. So before I move on, I just want to just say concerning A Doll's House and this concept of the new woman. The new woman breaks away from the true woman that we've talked about over and over again in past lectures. Remember, the true woman embodied this concept of being pious in the domestic sphere, almost like the wife of the wealthy that we just talked about before. But the new woman was almost like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, leaving the domestic sphere to seek her own destiny. Go back to the quote from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, because that embodies everything of the new woman. If you get to your book, you're also going to see at the end there's a bunch of primary documents pertaining to the new woman. She is a typewriter. She is on the beach in her swimsuit. She is bicycling. She is a doctor. So the list goes on and on of how the new woman broke away from this traditional sense of what a woman should be in that time period. And please, 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 when you watch this, take note of the character Nora and all of the things she does to show that she is a new woman at the end. So let's wrap this up. From emancipated women to women's rights activists to the new woman, all fought against their injustices and fought against the expected societal stereotypes.